Welcome friends. Topic of today's lecture is Anatomical Basis of Argyll Robertson Pupil. Argyll Robertson Pupil is a condition in which accommodation reflex is present but the light reflex is absent. To know this condition, we have to first look on the two pathways of the accommodation reflex and the light reflex. Light reflex is of two types: direct and indirect light reflex or consensual light reflex. When I put light into my right eye, it will lead to constriction of my right pupil. This is known as direct light reflex. Also, when I put light into my right eye, it will lead to constriction of my left pupil also. This is known as indirect or consensual light reflex. So now we will look into how this reflex pathway has worked. Suppose this is the left eye, this is the right eye, the two optic nerves crossing over at the level of optic chiasma, continuing as optic tract, the two lateral geniculate bodies, cut section of the midbrain at the level of superior colliculus, the central canal, the substantia nigra. Now, suppose when the light falls on the right eye, information is carried from the retina to the optic nerve, right side optic nerve. From the optic nerve, the nasal fibers will cross over at the level of the optic chiasma and the temporal fibers will go into the ipsilateral optic tract. From the optic tract, the fibers will, instead of relaying into the lateral geniculate body, will bypass this lateral geniculate body and will relay into a nucleus in the midbrain known as the pretectal nucleus, lying in front of the superior colliculus or in the tectal area of the midbrain. These fibers will not only relay into the ipsilateral pretectal nucleus but also into the opposite side or the contralateral side pretectal nucleus. This crossing over to the opposite side occurs at the level of posterior commissure. Okay, and this was the pretectal nucleus. From the pretectal nucleus, information will relay to another nucleus in the midbrain, that is a parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve known as the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So from here, information will be carried to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Here also there is bilateral representation. That is that the right side pretectal nucleus will not only lead to the right side Edinger-Westphal nucleus but also to the contralateral or opposite side Edinger-Westphal nucleus also. From the Edinger-Westphal nucleus arises the oculomotor nerve, through which the parasympathetic fibers of this nucleus will go through. Through the oculomotor nerve, the information will be carried toward another ganglia which is present into the orbit, apex of the orbit known as the ciliary ganglia. Here, these fibers will relay. This was known as the ciliary ganglia. Okay, from this ganglia, postganglionic fibers will come out through small nerves which are known as the short ciliary nerves. And through these short ciliary nerves, they will supply the intrinsic muscle of the eye known as the sphincter pupillae muscle. Sphincter pupillae muscle. This muscle will then cause contraction or constriction of the pupil of this side. Therefore, we can say when light falls on the right eyeball through this pathway, that is through the retina, then through the optic nerve, then through the optic chiasma, then through the optic tract, then into the pretractor nucleus, then the Argyll Robertson nucleus, and through the oculomotor nerve and short circuit nerves, it will, by supplying the sphincter pupillae, causes constriction of the right pupil. This was the pathway for the direct light reflex. Now, what about the indirect light reflex? In indirect light reflex, as we can see that from here, information is also carried, or information is carried bilaterally towards the opposite pretractor nucleus, also to the opposite Argyll Robertson nucleus. So, when information comes to the opposite side pretractor nucleus and the Argyll Robertson nucleus, there will be information nucleus. Information will all when it is the opposite side pretractor nucleus and the Argyll Robertson nucleus, information that also be carried by the opposite side oculomotor nerve also, and through the oculomotor nerve it will lay into the ciliary ganglia, and through the ciliary ganglia the postganglionic fibers will arise to the short circuit nerves and supply the opposite side sphincter pupillae muscle, also causing constriction of pupil of the opposite side also. This is the pathway for the indirect light reflex. Now we will see the pathway for the accommodation reflex. Suppose this is the two eyes, the left eye and the right eye. These are two optic nerves crossing over at the level of the optic chiasma, then the optic tract, the two lateral geniculate bodies, the cut section of the midbrain, the cerebral cortex, this is the visual cortex, this is the frontal and the parietal cortex. So now what happens in accommodation? Accommodation reflex is basically whenever a distant object is brought nearer to the eye, the events occurring in the eye is together known as accommodation reflex. In this, three events occur. First is the constriction of pupil. Second is the convergence of the eyeball towards the object. And the third is the thickening of the lens to decrease the focal length. Thickening of. Okay. The constriction is brought about by the constrictor pupillae muscle. Convergence of the eye towards the object is brought about by these two muscles which are present medially of the eyeball known as the medial rectus muscle, and thickening of the lens is produced by the contraction of a intrinsic muscle of the eyeball known as the ciliaris muscle. So let us see what happens in the accommodation reflex. Whenever an object is brought from a distance towards the eye, This information is carried from the retina. From the retina, information is carried through the optic nerve, and that will pass on to the optic chiasma, where the nasal fibers will cross over and the temporal fibers will go towards the same side or the ipsilateral side optic tract. Through the optic tract, it will then relay into the lateral geniculate body. From the lateral geniculate body, some neurons will arise and will relay to the visual cortex. These fibers are known as geniculocalcarine fibers. The visual cortex is present around the sulcus, which is known as the calcarine sulcus in the occipital lobe. From the visual cortex, area 17, 18 and 19. From the visual cortex will arise and will relay through the superior longitudinal fasciculus into an area on the frontal cortex known as the frontal eye field. Having Brodmann's area number 8. This frontal eye field is present in the posterior part of middle frontal gyrus. From the frontal eye field, the descending fibers, that is the corticonuclear fibers, will relay or project towards the midbrain into a nucleus complex in the midbrain known as the oculomotor nuclear complex. This consists of a oculomotor nucleus and an Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which was the parasympathetic component of this nucleus. So it will relay on both the nucleus, main oculomotor nucleus as well as the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of third cranial nerve. From both the nucleus arises the third cranial nerve, that is the oculomotor nerve. Okay. Through the oculomotor nerve, fibers will pass both the parasympathetic as well as motor fibers to the extraocular muscles. Through the oculomotor nerve, the motor fibers to the medial rectus will directly relay. Suppose this is the medial rectus, and the oculomotor nerve will directly relay to the medial rectus. The parasympathetic component will first relay into a ganglia which was known as the ciliary ganglia, and through the ciliary ganglia the postganglion fibers will arise and will go through the short ciliary nerves and then relay into the two intrinsic muscles of the eyeball, that is the sphincter pupillae muscle as well as the ciliaris muscle, which causes thickening of the lens. So here we can see that whenever an object was brought from distance to the near, information was, a stimulus was carried from the retina to the optic nerve, through the optic chiasma, to the two optic tracts into the lateral geniculate body, and through the lateral geniculate body information was given to the visual cortex. Then through the visual cortex information was carried to the frontal eye field. Through the frontal eye field, the projecting fibers, that is the corticonuclear fibers, projected towards the oculomotor nerve complex, which carried information for contraction through the oculomotor nerve directly to the medial rectus, and the parasympathetic fibers through the ciliary ganglia into both the ciliaris as well as the constrictor pupillae muscle. This caused the contraction of all the three muscles. When the medial rectus contracted, it led to convergence of the eyeball to medially of both the eyes. When the constrictor pupillae muscle constricted, it causes constriction of the pupil, and when the ciliaris muscle contracted, it led to thickening of the lens. So this way accommodation reflex occurs. If we now superimpose the light reflex, or we can recall the light reflex on this diagram, then through the retina to the optic nerve, then to the optic chiasma, then to the optic tract, not relaying into the lateral genicular body but bypassing it, then relaying into another nucleus in the midbrain which is known as the pretectal nucleus, and it was relaying bilaterally, and through the pretectal nucleus relaying into the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, that also bilaterally, and through the Edinger-Westphal nucleus it was then going to the oculomotor nerve. It was going to the oculomotor nerve, going to the oculomotor nerve, and through the oculomotor nerve it goes to the ciliary ganglia, and from the ciliary ganglia to the short ciliary nerves it relates to the sphincter pupillae muscle. And now we can explain the anatomical basis of Argyll Robertson pupil in this. In Argyll Robertson pupil, there occurs in lesion or injury to the pretectal region, or we can say to the pretectal nucleus of the midbrain. So suppose here is the injury. So we can see here, if the pretectal nucleus is affected, then which was the part of the light reflex, therefore the light reflex will be absent. Okay. But what about the accommodation reflex? The pretectal nucleus was nowhere in the pathway of the accommodation reflex. So we can see, or we can decipher out that there will be no chances of injury or lesion to the accommodation reflex. So in this case, the accommodation reflex would be present and this would be absent. Okay, now I think you have got the anatomical basis of Argyll Robertson pupil in a simple manner. Thank you.